Mhm. Hey folks, we'll get started in a couple moments, just letting people load on in, as is the nature of Zoom rooms. Mhm. Hi everyone, just waiting for folks to populate, as they say. All right, hello everyone, and good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jackie from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Jonathan Lee, presenting his new book, The Great Mistake. He'll be talking with Téa Obreht, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Jonathan, Téa, and the team at Knopf for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces at the moment, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're so grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. And just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar this evening, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. The exact location depends on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other tonight throughout the event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a single speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat, send your love for the authors. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question and you'd like to have it answered by the authors, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two dialoguing speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions exclusively from the Q&A this evening to be answered later on in the program. So if, as they're having their rich conversation, you're like, I really want to know this though, you can put it in the Q&A, it'll be saved, and we'll get back to it in a bit. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Great Mistake, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations from 12 to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Jonathan's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store, or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat in just a moment. Jonathan is stopping by our store to sign copies of the book later this week, so you can get a signed copy by request while supplies last. Please make sure to indicate that you want a signed copy in your order comments if you're ordering online. Or you can look for the signed copy sticker if you visit us in store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors like Jonathan and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores like Greenlight, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. So our interviewer tonight is Téa Obreht. She is the author of international bestseller, The Tiger's Wife, a finalist for the National Book Award, and the winner of the 2011 Orange Prize for Fiction. Obreht was a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree and was named by The New Yorker as one of the 20 best American fiction writers under 40. She was the 2013 Rana Jaffe Foundation Fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers and was the recipient of the 2016 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Her most recent book is the New York Times bestseller, Inland. Téa has appeared on Greenlight stage many times before as both author and interviewer, and we're incredibly honored to have her with us again. She will be speaking with our featured author this evening, Jonathan Lee. He's the author of 3 novels, most recently High Dive, which was the best book of the year in publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle. His new book, The Great Mistake, is the story of a city transformed, a murder that made a private man infamous, and a portrait of a singular individual who found the world closed off to him, yet enlarged it. The book has been praised by fellow writers Garth Greenwell, Katie Simpson-Smith, Stephanie Danler, and tonight's interviewer, Téa Obreht, who says, few writers working today have Jonathan Lee's range or eye for detail. Fewer still are capable of roaming minds and histories with such bittersweet, richly detailed ease, or taking on with such profound depth all the messy, hilarious, heartbreaking humanity of a person and a time, and indeed an entire city. The Great Mistake is a wonder and a delight. So Jonathan's gonna start us off with a short reading from the book, and then we'll be talking with Téa and with all of you. Please take it away, Jonathan, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Welcome.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and to Greenlight for hosting, and for Téa for doing this as well. This is The Great Mistake, a copy I prepared earlier. It's my novel about a 19th century civic leader He ended up being murdered on Park Avenue at the age of 83, kind of after creating modern New York. Andrew Haswell Green was a real person. Without him, there might be no Central Park, no Metropolitan Museum of Art, no New York Public Library, maybe no merger of Manhattan with Brooklyn into a single city. He was kind of one of the greatest creators of public space in the history of any city, but he's been forgotten, and that's surprising. And I came across a bench dedicated to him in 2012 in Central Park. That's one of the few memorials that still exists to him. It was absolutely covered in bird shit, but it's there, and it's a small memorial to his memory, and it calls him the father of Greater New York. And I got curious, and this book is the result of that curiosity. I'm going to read just like a few paragraphs from the first chapter before Téa and I chat. Andrew Haswell Green at this point is 83, and what you're hearing about is the day of his death on Park Avenue in 1903. The last attempt on the life of Andrew Haswell Green took place on Park Avenue in 1903. News of his murder filled the front page of the New York Times. Father of Greater New York shot in front of his home. The motive was offstage, unaccounted for. Speculation filled the Herald, the Tribune, the Sun. Some writers got excited by the victim's fame or the 5 shots fired. Others stared straight-faced at the date of his death, Friday, November 13th. Citizens prone to long neck dreams carried pocket pieces on unlucky days like these. Rabbit's feet and rusty screws, Pope Pius IX in a paperweight, the pit of a peach named Stump the World, items mute and immune to worry, charms to protect them from bedlam. But at the age of 83, Andrew had no time for fetishes. The things he trusted late in life were grass and trees and weeds, buildings and bridges made of stone. And after his absurd ending had faded from the news, a marble bench was erected in his name in Central Park. This small memorial can still be found overlooking the open greenery of Fort Fish. On Tuesday mornings, a person with cleaning supplies arrives to remove last week's bird shit with a brush. On Andrew's fateful final morning, as the Times would describe it, he woke early and spent a long time preparing to move. And he descended 16 stairs with care and sat down at his table of Massachusetts maple under an electric-only chandelier. Park Avenue was waking beyond the window. Dust rose and fell behind passing carts. Wheels creaked as they carried Friday loads across the cobbles. Coffee made with 36 beans was best. This was his conclusion after decades of private research, and he sipped steadily from his favorite cup, the yellow of elm leaves in fall, until Mrs. Bray came in with breakfast. "How did you sleep?" she asked. "Like the dead," he said. They shared the smile they always shared, then lifted knives and forks. Afterwards, he rinsed his cup out in the sink and traveled to his office near City Hall, where he remained until 1 o'clock, the rest of his day looking ordinary, ordinary, ordinary. Feeling a bit singing tonight. Ordinary. He walked out into the bustle of Broadway and took a moment to catch his breath. The Herald would describe the impending crime as occurring on one of those well-cut November afternoons when the sun shines bright and the wind blows cold, when it's fall in the light and winter in the shade. The sun would maintain that the skies were darkly overcast. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle would stand entirely alone in claiming it was raining. In this unreliable weather, Andrew rode the 4th Avenue streetcar uptown, as would later be recorded in the police report, with a look of amused determination on his face, the sharp features that made his moods look worse than they were, his white beard flickering in the wind as he went. He loved the press of cold air against his face, the way it seemed to tighten the skin. Only the skyline upset him as he moved through the city, the showy mess of buildings of different heights which stood, he felt, in incoherent argument with one another. He loved New York. He hated it. It was a cathedral of possibilities. It would never settle down. It might remember him or it might forget him. There was a sense of no control. And for some reason, he hesitated now, thinking city thoughts or lunch thoughts or other thoughts entirely, as he finally made it back to the little iron railing which ran along the front of his home. And because of this hesitation and 1,000 other factors, a raw sprawl of coincidences and missteps and mistakes, a measure of bad luck and a degree of design, he would soon be lying on the ground with his face to the sky, sprawled and embarrassed, well on his way to becoming, in the words of one cab driver across the street, dead as a tent peg. Or in the formulation of Mr. Anton the florist, a man who claimed to love nature despite what it had done to his face, dead as a herring, as dead as a sightless eye, as dead as a soulless sentence, as dead as a doornail or a cliche or a lucky rabbit's foot or the pit of a peach named Stump the World, as lifeless as all the newspapers that would bear his name in the morning. Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Thanks, Téa.
Hi, John.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi, good. How are you?
I'm good. I have a tiny bit of whiskey mixed with chamomile tea in my mug, and it's going really well.
That's great. That's great. The more is mixed in, the better things go in a reading, is my understanding. So
yeah.
Congratulations on The Great Mistake. It's such an amazing book.
Thank you. Thanks so much for supporting it.
Well, it's an incredible narrative achievement, and it's already being recognized as one of the best books of the year. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here at Greenlight to ask you some questions about it. Do you mind if I jump right in?
Yeah. Well, I'm nervous. What are you gonna ask me?
Well, you introduced, actually, you already answered the first question I was going to ask, so I reframed it while you were reading. You told us about your first encounter with Andrew Haswell Green and the bird shit spattered bench. But I'm always really curious to know about the germ of an idea. And so I guess my question is, how did he make his way into your life? Or actually, how did that bench invite you into his life and story further?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was partly just an attraction to big statements and wanting to prod away at them a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think, I've always been interested in park benches and like their role as kind of city storytellers and the things that you find like graffitied on benches, but also the little golden plaques and who they're dedicated to, and imagining the stories behind those little chunks of story. In his case, this seldom visited part of the park overlooking Fort Fish, there's this bench that says Father of Greater New York, Creating Genius of Central Park, which are such big ways to describe an individual of whom I'd never heard a thing. And I think I assumed that a lot of more long-standing New Yorkers would know who he was. So I think that first impulse wasn't necessarily to like research a book and think that it could be a book, but to just like cover up my own ignorance, to put a bit of wallpaper over it. And then the more I looked into him, kind of the less I could find about him. It was just this curious thing. And the one thing that stood out to me was that he was murdered on Park Avenue in 1903. And then as I researched it further and got into boxes of documents and stuff at the New York Historical Society, this portrait of a like very private man who did all this great public work kind of came to the fore. And I don't know about you, I feel like as a writer, you're sometimes looking for those oppositions, and he was so private and he had such a public death, and he created Central Park and all these great public spaces. So I found that really interesting.
Yeah, and there's such a great opportunity, and I think you use it so wonderfully to create fiction out of the sort of the gaps that leave room for invention and then leave room for truth, and just the idea of the story. I was fascinated by your choice to start things off with the murder, right? Because in this way you set up a classic mystery, but you also subvert the reader's expectations about what the burning question of the narrative is actually going to be. So can you talk a little bit about the structure of the book and perhaps also the point of view and how they revealed themselves to you?
Yeah, definitely. I think to start with, I had a slightly more distant kind of narrative voice for the whole book, because I was starting with his death, and I sort of imagined that the book might be all about the aftermath of his death. And I was saying to someone the other day, but there's this Virginia Woolf quote in her diaries that I came across in a different context, which I really liked, which was, "I meant to write about death, only life came breaking in as usual." And I think there was something in that idea that I thought I was writing about his murder, but I ended up really writing about his life. And as I started sort of alternating the chapters between the investigation into his death and sort of quieter moments behind the headline grabbing stuff, little private moments in his very private life, I just felt like that juxtaposition that we talked about was sort of coming to the fore in the structure of the book itself. So I really liked that. And I also wanted to make space to sort of incorporate like little chunks of newspaper text and things that I came across along the way, and sort of blur the fact and fiction together a little bit.
Great. I love that in a sense you you were able to replicate your own surprise at finding out who this man was, and finding your way into the story through the murder first, because that's the most public thing known about him. That you were able to replicate that experience for the reader and then enhance it with your own universe. It's almost as though you went out and scouted the area first and found all this fantastic stuff, and the perfect way to put it, to build affection and intimacy with somebody who we didn't even know we needed to know. And that's sort of the experience of reading the book. You had an essay this past weekend in which you talked about how great I am. No, in which you in which you found a powerful defense of historical fiction, which in your own words, editors can sometimes relegate into a kind of genre space, which and then you sort of get into this battle about literary merit and particularly because historical fiction is perceived as not dealing with the immediate cultural present. So I think people often think that research is simply seeking out the facts of a particular historical period, but it's a lot more than that. Of course, it's about detail, but also language and psychology and building a world for the character to inhabit and then react to. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of research you did for The Great Mistake? In particular, for example, the kind of research that you did to understand Green and get into his mind.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I suppose in terms of secondary source stuff, I soon gave up on reading a whole bunch of books about the time. I sort of did that, but in the end, I sort of found the hindsight element not particularly useful, like the sort of prioritization of information based on what we might think now of 1903 or any of the decades before. And I started to do instead a lot of like reading of the newspapers of the time. So if I was writing a chapter about like Green in the 1850s, I would usually try and build that. I'm curious what you did in England, but I would usually try and build a scene around a specific day and decide when that day was. And then I would go into the New York Times archives, which are online and very searchable and very useful. And I would read the newspaper pretty much back to front for that day. And I found that to be really useful because there was a whole bunch of stuff, of course, that was going on that hasn't made it into the history books since. And I think it's sometimes those smaller little corners of history or shreds of bigger events or shadows cast by bigger events which make the most impact on people's individual individual lives. So I spent a lot of time doing things like reading the newspapers, and reading the tabloids of the time was kind of interesting when thinking about the coverage of Green's death, because that was the sensational bit, you know, before he fell into forgetting. And also fascinating was being at the New York Historical Society with a great librarian who managed to pull out 4 or 5 boxes of Green's diaries and letters. And I could just see that those hadn't been checked out for years. And I'm sure you've had similar moments. That's just a thrilling thing when you realize you're accessing something that perhaps has been overlooked. And the whole novel is about that, really. It's about accessing a story that's been overlooked.
Yeah. Well, you based much of the novel's supporting cast on real people too, and I'm curious if you can talk about whom you chose to include and how you calibrated their involvement in the main storyline.
Yeah, I think there were drafts of the novel where I was inventing more characters. I think in the end, everyone is based to some extent on facts. There were moments where, you know, there's like maybe 3 paragraphs about a guy called Acting Captain Daly. Well, all I knew about him from the historical record is that he was called Acting Captain Daly, and he was referred to in the investigation documents as Acting Captain Daly. So that's all I had for him. But even that, I think you can find a character emerging from that. It's like, well, he's acting. What does he want? He probably wants to be actual. Like, he doesn't want to be acting anymore. He wants to be actual Captain Daly. Inspector McCluskey was a character who, you know, he was fascinating to research. He's the guy who kind of led the murder investigation into Green, which, you know, in my book is The Great Mistake, is more of a why-done-it, I guess, than a whodunit. But there wasn't a ton of information out there on him, but a couple of things that unlocked him for me in my imagination were references to him single-handedly rounding up crooks from the Tenderloin district on St. Patrick's Day. There was like a great article about that, I think, in the Times, where it described him like single-handedly throwing all these criminals in the back of his carriage and leading various early mafia types sort of to flee New York completely afterwards in fear of him. And then another article that I was really pleased to discover after a lot of time digging around a colleague referred to him as an elephant sympathizer. And that was because he was spoken up after the execution of Topsy the elephant. You know, that story of like the Coney Island elephant who, you know, sort of ran amok, and of course it was the fault of the human beings and not of this poor elephant that was in captivity, but it was decided that he must be executed publicly in Coney Island. And Inspector McCluskey sort of stood up for this elephant effectively and kind of lost the respect of his colleagues. So those were like 2 fascinating bits, and again, like a whole character kind of came out of some of those old details.
It sounds like a sort of a perfect, it sounds like the perfect environment for your imagination to thrive, because you get these sort of little snippets and then you're able to string a whole life through them without having to omit them. But I'm curious about whether you ended up having to part with, I feel like, I don't know about you, but when I do research, I tend to go down these rabbit holes and everything feels super, super relevant. And you know, especially when you're dealing with newspapers and there's just this massive events that you're contending with. And then the problem becomes seeing your way back to what the actual bigger story is and having to cut back on all this wonderful rich detail that you've you know, found or come up with. And I'm curious whether you found the process of editing more challenging in a historical novel in which you had done so much work to build the world, than you do in perhaps than you have in some of your books that have been set in more contemporary times?
I think I did. I think I found the editing more difficult in some ways because you put more years behind each chapter. And I also think, and I don't know about you, I think I became more conscious of the editing because you write about history and you become very aware, I think, throughout the process of the ways in which history itself is edited and always editing itself, and what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, and what gets told aslant and what seemingly gets told straight and what's omitted. And I think the first impulse, or my first impulse with this book, was like include everything, and that certainly meant including all the big events in Andrew Haswell Green's life. And it took me a while to realize that those things could kind of be off stage actually, and that a lot of it was about his rise to becoming the person who could do these things. So, you know, at some point the book, instead of being 300 pages, was more like 600 pages. And, you know, it had stuff in it about the Bronx Zoo. You know, it was like, I had a scene where it's 1899, Andrew Haswell Green is founding the Bronx Zoo, and it was fascinating, but it didn't belong in the story. You know, equally, you know, his creation of Riverside Drive, Fort Washington Park, like Morningside Park in 1867. You know, obviously there's some stuff in there about the creation of the Met, and Central Park is central to the narrative, and the New York Public Library too. But I started to see things through the lens of like, well, what was most fascinating in a way to me was thinking about how his early life, before anyone knew who he was, way before he was famous, well before he was shot, well before he was called the father of Greater New York, shaped the later stuff. And I think, you know, it started to become clear to me that things like the creation of Central Park and the New York Public Library were really important to the narrative, but there was a way of telling that just by having him like arrive in New York at the age of 15 and loving to walk and to read, and not really being able to afford to do it either, because the safest spaces to walk were the pleasure gardens where you needed to buy a ticket. And as you know, like the whole system of libraries in New York at that time was just private libraries where you had to spend a month's wages to like take a single book out. So it's interesting to think about whether there would even be a Central Park or a New York Public Library if he hadn't liked reading and walking and hadn't been poor.
Yeah. Why do you think, what do you think so little is known about a figure who was so instrumental and whose sort of personal predilections and gifts were so instrumental to the development of New York?
It's interesting. I mean, I've asked myself that a lot, obviously, and yeah, I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I think, you know, I have sort of compared in my mind a couple of times Andrew Haswell Green, the protagonist of the novel, with Robert Moses, you know, like another creator of modern New York. And I think, you know, it's been said that Andrew Haswell Green is a kind of 19th century Robert Moses. And I think whereas Moses was like a great self-promoter and had so much ego at play in everything he did and was kind of his own best publicist, I think that Green was the opposite. I think he was determined. He was sort of indomitable when it came to seeing a public project through. You know, when everyone else gave up on the idea of Central Park during wartime, he was like, no, we can do it on the skeleton budget and we can get it done. And he fell out with the designers in the process. But I think that, you know, Moses was always had one eye on his reputation, and Green was more the type of person who shrunk back into his public work. There's also the question of his sexuality, because, you know, there is quite a lot of evidence that he had some kind of relationship that was more than platonic, but perhaps unconsummated, with Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. And And then lastly, it sort of seemed like, you know, the circumstances of his murder were perceived to be like ungentlemanly. You know, like it was like he was shrouded in an aura of scandal at the end. And that, I mean, that is pretty harsh to get murdered and then for people to hold it against you. But I think for a while people did think it was because he'd been mixing with the wrong sorts of people, you know, by the definition of the day.
Yeah. You bring up his sexuality, and I think one of the things that we're beginning to talk about much more clearly in sort of cultural conversations today is the absence of LGBTQ history, or the need to you know, revive these figures from LGBTQ history and properly venerate them for being who they were. And I was wondering if you could talk about this, the challenges and I think joys of trying to interrogate this possible love story between two real people, one of whom is better known and you know, one of whom is your lesser known protagonist.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the first thing to say is probably that it crept up on me because it was probably a year or two into the research into this figure that I got interested in that it started to dawn on me, and I started to find the documents that suggested his sexuality. Although there had been a lot of sort of stuff about that at the time, but you know, in the parlance of the day, he was described as a confirmed bachelor and things like that. But I wouldn't have relied on that if I hadn't found some primary documents. But I mean, it's interesting because, you know, in the end, obviously a person's interior life belongs only to them. So I did feel like a trespasser at some times on this narrative. And I think that sort of made its way into the book in some ways, you know, a sense of, you know, he's this ghost that I'm investigating, but I think you can sort of feel the ghost of me in the narrative too, like trying to piece together his story and wondering when to step forward and when to step back and what is a respectful distance. And so I tried to sort of make that part of the book, but I do think that, you know, every novel which explores a real person is a kind of act of trespass. And maybe it's like more visceral if it's like a TV show like The Crown, and there's like, you know, they may be rich, but a real family somewhere who may or may not be watching and experiencing something. I suppose it's different when someone's been dead for well over a century, but at the same time, I did feel like there was a responsibility to do more research than I'd ever done before in my life, because already this has probably become, just in the space of a week, like the best known account of his life, and it says novel on the front, but tried to do justice to the contours of that life and also to the specific relationships he seemed to have with people. His relationship with his father was also, you know, pretty complex.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think you do a beautiful job. I have a question about cool things. What's the strangest or coolest thing you learned about the city during the research of this book? Or something that surprised you the most?
I mean, one really strange thing which came in that I sort of researched things in phases, and I started with the 1830s because that was when he arrived in New York, and to find like little mentions in his diaries of the sounds of gunfire going on all the time, and then it took a while to like piece that together with the diaries of other historical figures from the time, that there were these sort of seasons of shooting dogs on the streets of New York City, and that you get sort of 50 cents per death, you know, there were just so many wild dogs roaming around the city at the time, alongside, you know, pigs and all sorts of other creatures, of course. But that was a sort of moment where things clicked for me. This sense that you're living in a city, but the northernmost point of the livable city is around what we think of as, say, the Lower East Side at the moment, and that there are these, and that he's being woken every night by the sound of people trying to make money by shooting dogs outside his windows. That's the kind of detail that I think helps you access someone's head. So there were also lots of like fascinating little minutes that I found of Central Park planning meetings, and that was fascinating because
Amazing.
you know, sometimes you think that a scene or a chapter or an idea is like beyond the scope of your imagination, and one of the things I found reading these minutes from sort of meetings in the 1850s and 60s of people who were trying to plan what they called the middle park at the time, before Andrew Haswell Green suggested, among other people, that central made you think of the heart and like middle made you think of the gut. So he kind of rebranded it. But it was a revelation to realize like meetings are pretty much the same as they are now. You know, like someone gets up and talks too long and shouts all the people down, and then someone falls asleep, and there's all these accounts, you know, in the minutes of all these different little things happening, and it sort of played out as comedy, and that was something that helped me access some of that space. The idea that history is made through, you know, men in small rooms being comically boorish to each other sometimes. You know, I was able to have fun with that.
I love that. All right. Well, I have a few more questions, and I'm drawing to the end of my time of sort of holding the floor to talk to John. So those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please do type them into the chat or into the Q&A section. Your novels often build or turn on a shocking or violent action. Can you talk a little bit about why you're drawn to stories that present this opportunity to you or to the reader?
Yeah, I suppose I'm as drawn as anyone else is to those sort of big dramatic moments where everything seems to change in an instant. Then I think, you know, I was talking to someone the other day who was sort of asking about what the difference between literary fiction and like a Hollywood script is, or really commercial fiction on the other hand. And of course, like a lot of these labels don't really mean much, as we both know. But I think that I'm interested in looking at those big moments and then using them as a way to peel back and find the quieter moments that lie behind them, the quieter little decision points along the way. That tends to be where my instinct goes. So I want to find the smaller resonances in big events like that, or behind big events like that. Whereas I suppose the Hollywood version is more like you take a big event and you amplify it further and further.
Yeah.
And it just seems a useful way to me to explore everyday lives and the way that history turns on everyday decisions, I think. Maybe there'll be a way to do it too, by starting with a really quiet moment and building. I mean, I have this book on my desk called The Stone Diaries by Carol Shields, which is a wonderful example of that. You know, it's the story of one woman's life over 90 years, and it starts in a very quiet way and builds from there. But I just find life is a bit more like someone makes a noise and you turn and it gets your attention, and then you notice the other things.
I love that. You're an editor also at Catapult, and you've launched the careers of many emerging writers over the years. And the tribe of literary editors who also write brilliant books is a very small one. Can you talk a little bit about how these aspects of your writing life, your life behind the scenes and your life on the page affect or influence one another?
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that writing and editing are kind of part of the same work of trying to put meaningful art out in the world, you know, whether it's someone else's or sometimes hopefully mine. And I think I was thinking about this the other day, and you know, I do think that anyone who wants to be a writer needs to be a reader first. And sometimes, I'm sure you get this too, you know, sometimes after an event or whatever, someone will come up and say, and have all these questions about the practicalities of being a writer and be like really caught up with in, you know, how to make it happen for themselves. And when you sort of inquire a bit, they haven't, you know, really written a page of their book yet. And maybe they're not also a big reader either. And it's sort of that just that very natural thing to happen. And I'm sure I was the same when I was starting out, but just like trying to remember that the text itself kind of has to come first. It's a losing game to try and be, you know, a writer without caring about books first. And obviously editing is a really close form of reading. I think it does strengthen that group of muscles that you need to write a book, but also to finish a book, because, you know, we both know that most people don't finish a book, and it's because other things are always turning your head, and there is always a more fascinating idea that seems to be easier to write out there, or just seems more attractive in some way. But I mean, is it the same for you with teaching? I mean, does that feel like a close form of reading too? Does it feel like the same muscle group?
It does, I think, and it feels too sort of like a scenario in which I think that in the process of writing, I feel very free to sort of float from persuasion to persuasion and principle to principle. You know, everything sort of is loosey-goosey, first draft, and the persistent process of convincing yourself that it'll all come together by the end. But in teaching, you're forced to articulate the means by which something arrives at an end, or the reasons for why someone else's work isn't there yet. And then that, of course, forces the consideration of your own, right? And on the way home on the subway, or you know, immediately after a workshop, you're sort of forced to contend with, well, I just said that to that young writer. You know, how does it apply to my work? Do you find that has editing made you a better editor of your own work? Has editing enabled you to go further down the line of editing your work than you were previously able to? Or do you have a sort of set stopping place for where you no longer feel like you're the person who is capable of seeing it all?
I think
Is it extended? I'm trying to figure out a way to
I think you're right. I think it's a bit of both. I think there is still very much a point where you can't be the person who sees the flaws in what you've written. You just need an outside perspective, and that's why all writers could benefit from a good editor, or maybe multiple early readers even. The same, I do think that being an editor too has enabled me to get outside myself a little bit. Like I think there are moments where, as you say, like you encounter a writer or a student or whoever it might be, and you find yourself articulating something to that person, and then realizing like that very evening that you have run afoul of the same rule. And you know, one of the rules that I always try and say to people is like, just don't be boring, you know, just like which is probably not that helpfully specific, but just to remember that your goal is to keep someone engaged by the language or an idea or a character, or to have like some kind of wit or like a line that crackles with charisma or whatever it might be, especially on that first page. And yet, you know, I find myself being boring all the time, you know, in drafts. I'm sort of looking back and I'm like, well, why is that chapter there? And then I have to ask myself, like, is it boring or not? Is it necessary or not? And I think that process of questioning is like such a big part of writing, isn't it? Because most writing is rewriting. And when you start, you think you'll do the start to the finish and that'll be it. And you forget that most of the time is going to be spent working things over.
We have a question from the audience. Dan Sheehan wants to know, he says, this book is already being hailed as a great New York novel. Absolutely. What are some of your favorite New York set novels or stories? I'm going to click answer live.
I really like a lot of the New York nonfiction specifically. I love a lot of New York novels too, but I love the stuff that sort of blurs fact and fiction a little bit, like, you know, Joseph Mitchell's Up in the Old Hotel, like those
so good,
stories.
yeah.
So good, right? I mean, like profiles that presented as profiles of New Yorkers, many of which appeared in the New Yorker magazine as nonfiction, and we've sort of since found out that he was collapsing characters, or he was finding out like just a couple of little details, his equivalent of discovering an elephant sympathizer, and then he goes off and writes a whole imagined profile and presents it to his editor as if it might be fact, or maybe just doesn't say anything at all. I love all those kinds of stories, and I feel like those are my favorite New Yorker profiles still, the ones that before they started focusing only on people who are famous. I love the ones about everyday New Yorkers. I love E.B. White's Here is New York, which I feel like is also kind of a blend of fact and fiction, because, you know, he was given this task of writing about a day in the life of New York, and he ends up, instead of wandering around the city, it's like too hot, right? So it's like 90 degrees and he's cooped up in this tiny hotel room in Midtown with only himself for company, and he's kind of imagining a stroll around New York, and I love that. And then in terms of novels, I mean, I do love Toni Morrison's Jazz. That was one that I revisited recently. And I guess that's relevant too, because it's like, you know, it's 1920s Harlem, but it's sort of using that period in order to paint a picture of what was the now of the novel, whenever it was written. I guess it was published 30 years ago now. And it also sort of tracks back. Do you remember those bits where it kind of tracks back like 50, 60, 70 years to the sort of roots of those characters' predicaments? And I love that. And I love that it sort of, you know, it evokes the jazz of its title. It's sort of structurally in there.
Yeah, for sure. Do we have?
I think I saw one question about public space, which I guess we haven't talked about.
Spaces in the where? I don't see it,
I mean,
but what is it? But I would like you to talk about public space. That's one of my questions.
I mean, that was one of the interesting things, because I guess, you know, the pandemic's made us reassess public spaces in our lives, hasn't it? And I felt like that crept up on me a little bit as I was doing the copy edits for this, that here was this guy, Green, who had done so much to create for like New York public schools and for creating the New York Public Library and Central Park and all the rest of it. And I think he was ahead of his time in seeing the health benefits, physical and mental, and spaces where people could kind of mingle and strangers could be together, but and less alone, but also still be alone if they wanted to. And and that was really interesting to be like finishing up the book, the copy edits at least at that phase where, you know, parks had become, places like Central Park had become a real reprieve from isolation again, like a really, really valuable space for so many people. And pubs and restaurants were spilling out onto sidewalks, and, you know, schemes to reclaim city streets were kind of flourishing in some places, and even just like schools being open. I mean, you remember that period where it was like, you realize that you can't take anything for granted, and the public infrastructure of cities like New York is kind of as fragile as the guy who created so much of it, I think.
Sure. And I think there is something about civic life that inherently invites, I mean, perhaps it's not civic life, it's modern life, right? Like that invites the idea of stability, and invites this sense of permanence. That it's always been like this, right? Like it's not that somebody thought, why don't we have an equitable public space where, regardless of socioeconomic status or societal sins, someone can come in and walk and enjoy the spaces that anyone else can, or have access to the same services. And I'm curious about what is your personal experience, in your personal experience writing this novel, what is your counter argument to folks who might say that historical fiction does not speak to the current cultural moment? Like, what did you find, in addition to public space, what did you find yourself surprised by or moved by or angered by in your discovery of how the past speaks to the present?
Yeah, I suppose there were so many things, and it was, you know, a process of realizing you didn't even really need to underline some of them, that they were just there. I mean, one of them was Boss Tweed, who I think someone is making an HBO show about at the moment, which I'll be fascinated to watch. But, you know, this corrupt official, you know, former chairmaker who ends up becoming the center of power in New York, like the head of Tammany Hall, and the press was scared to criticize him because, you know, places like the New York Times and many others had advertising budgets that needed to be filled, and he was like very generous at making sure he filled those budgets. So you can see things like the collapsing space between editorial and advertising and things like that. But so much about Tweed was so horrifyingly Trumpian that I almost had to edit down some of the things he said. I mean, like, one of his speeches is kind of in the book almost verbatim, and he's talking about making New York great again. And he's talking about, you know, prioritizing American manufacture over overseas goods, and about how he represents the rights of working people, even though at the same time we know that he was just sort of absolutely filling his pockets with the city's money and leaving the weaker in society completely worse off. And there were moments like that where you just put him on the page, and it's almost like a process of pulling back on contemporary resonance because it's already there, but it does remind you that these things go in cycles, which could be depressing or it could be encouraging in some ways, because you know,
well, you cycle in, which means you'll cycle out, but sorry.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess just more generally, like I suppose I said this in the New York Times piece, but I mean, I do think historical fiction really hasn't been in fashion for most of the last few decades. And I think that Inland, your novel, is like a great example of sort of reinventing historical Western, for example, and C. Pan Zhang's as well. And I think there's a sort of distrust of imagination and research has sort of crept in a little bit, and that's starting to change again, I think. You know, with ever since the success of the Wolf Hall novels and novels like The Underground Railroad. I do think that that's starting to change, and we're seeing writers kind of tackle history and not being so sort of ashamed of it, which of course they shouldn't be, because it's there's more than one way to explore the way we live now. It doesn't have to be writing about now.
Yeah. I want to ask you about perhaps one more question about the way, about now. You're a transnational writer of remarkable range. Your novels jump countries and historical periods and interests. What, in your view, is the enduring preoccupation that seems to follow you consistently across all your work?
I mean, it has been said by a New Yorker critic that I seem to be obsessed with people falling down. And it wasn't something I'd noticed before. But this novel too does start with Andrew Haswell Green falling down on Park Avenue, as tends to happen when someone shoots you down. And High Dive obviously had its preoccupations of falling from a great height in terms of diving, but also in terms of what happened to the Grand Hotel when that IRA bomb went off in 1984, attempt to assassinate Margaret Thatcher. And even my first novel many years ago that came out in the UK and some other places, but only recently has been reissued over here. It's that started with, I think the very first line of that first novel is one Tuesday in September, my mother had a fall, and that was sort of based on the story of my grandmother, who after she died we found all of these letters. My dad found some of these letters, and it seemed like she had this other life. She'd had a fiance that she'd never told anyone about, and he died in a motorcycle accident. And there was this sense that even then, to me, that people have hidden histories that you will never know, or that you might see little glimpses of at some point, and that it's kind of the work of a lifetime to try and get those glimpses and imagine yourself into the gaps in the record. And I think that's probably what most of my work has been about. And hopefully at some point I'll just move on to something completely different, but I guess we don't choose what we write about sometimes.
Right, it chooses us, and I think that we're all very grateful. Your readers are grateful to you for illuminating those gaps in the lives of people, real and imagined, and ushering us into those spaces too, and allowing us to create intimacies with historical moments, with unknown episodes, and with people we never imagined we would be obsessed with. So thank you so much, Jonathan. I think that's about all the time we have. So thank you for.
I reappear when you say things like that. Téa and Jonathan, what an incredible evening. Thank you so much for having such a rich dialogue around public spaces, around the merits and the complexities of writing historical fiction. It was truly a pleasure to get to listen to you each speak. Please support Jonathan's new novel, Untitled from Greenlight Bookstore. I just put the chat back, the link back in the chat. Hey, and Jonathan, thank you so much for educating us all and interesting us all even further. I look forward to reading The Great Mistake, which I had not yet done. I normally get to spoil and get to do the events before I read the books. And I am so excited to now in a completely different angle than I necessarily would have been before. I hope folks who have been listening along are as well. And I wish you all a lovely evening. We'll see you next time you're here for an event. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Téa, as well, for being such a great questioner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, folks.